My name is Sarah and I'm 28 years old. For 6 years, I thought being a good daughter meant accepting that I would always be the outsider at my own family's restaurant, watching my younger brother get praised while I scrubbed floors and washed dishes in the back. I believed that loyalty meant smiling when my mother introduced me to customers as just the help while my brother got called the future owner. I thought love meant staying quiet when family meetings happened without me. When business decisions were made around our dinner table while I was conveniently sent on errands. Then came the night of my cousin's wedding reception at our restaurant, when my mother looked me straight in the eye and said those words that would change everything: "You can't sit with family." So I walked away from that table, and 3 months later, I ended up sitting at the owner's table of the most successful restaurant in town. But before I tell you how a family rejection became the best thing that ever happened to me, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Let me take you back to where this all began, in the small coastal town of Millbrook, Maine, where my family owned Rosa's Italian Kitchen, a restaurant that had been struggling to stay afloat for as long as I could remember. My father, Anthony Castellano, had inherited the place from his father, and like so many family businesses, it carried more tradition than profit. The red checkered tablecloths were the same ones from 1987, the wine list hadn't been updated since the Clinton administration, and the kitchen equipment made noises that would concern a health inspector. My mother, Gloria, handled the front of house with the kind of dramatic flair that made every customer interaction feel like a performance. She would glide between tables in her black dress and pearl necklace, speaking in hushed tones about family recipes and old-world traditions, as if we were running some kind of culinary museum instead of a business that barely paid its bills. My younger brother Michael, just 24 years old, was already being groomed as the heir apparent, despite having spent more time playing video games than learning about the restaurant industry. Growing up in this environment, I naturally gravitated toward the practical side of things. While Michael charmed customers with his easy smile and casual confidence, I was in the back learning how every single aspect of the operation worked. I knew which suppliers gave us the best deals, which equipment needed replacing, and which menu items actually turned a profit versus the ones we kept because they were traditional. I could prep vegetables faster than any of our part-time cooks, handle the register during busy nights, and solve problems that would send Michael running to find our parents. The restaurant became my second home, and not always by choice. After school, instead of hanging out with friends or participating in extracurricular activities, I would head straight to Rosa's to help with the dinner rush. Weekends meant long shifts that started with opening prep and ended with closing cleanup. Summer vacations were spent working double shifts while my classmates went to camps or traveled with their families. I told myself this was what family businesses required, that everyone had to sacrifice for the greater good. What I didn't realize until much later was that my sacrifices were being taken for granted while Michael's minimal contributions were celebrated. When he showed up for a few hours on weekends, Gloria would praise him to customers about how dedicated he was to the family business. When I worked a 12-hour shift to cover for a sick employee, it was simply expected. The double standard was so ingrained in our family dynamic that I accepted it as normal for years. During my senior year of high school, I started suggesting improvements that could help the restaurant attract younger customers and increase revenue. I proposed updating the menu with some modern Italian fusion dishes, creating a social media presence, and renovating the dining room to feel less like a time capsule. My ideas were politely dismissed with comments about respecting tradition and not fixing what wasn't broken, even though anyone with eyes could see that plenty was broken. After graduation, I enrolled in the local community college's business program while continuing to work at the restaurant full-time. I thought if I could gain formal education in business management and hospitality, my parents would start taking my input more seriously. I studied restaurant management, accounting, marketing, and food service operations, maintaining a perfect GPA while working nights and weekends at Rosa's. My business classes opened my eyes to just how poorly our restaurant was being managed. We had no real budget, no marketing strategy, no systems for inventory control, and no understanding of our actual profit margins. I started implementing small changes where I could, reorganizing the storage areas for better efficiency, tracking which dishes sold best on which days, and developing relationships with local suppliers who could provide better quality ingredients at competitive prices. The improvements I made were noticeable but rarely acknowledged. When food costs went down because I had negotiated better deals with vendors, Gloria credited it to her careful oversight. When customer complaints decreased because I had reorganized the kitchen workflow to improve service speed, Anthony praised Michael for his natural leadership skills, even though Michael had nothing to do with the changes. The most frustrating Part was watching Michael coast through his senior year of high school and then his first year of college without any real involvement in the restaurant, while being constantly praised for his business instincts and natural charisma. He would show up for Sunday family dinners and offer casual observations about the restaurant that would be received as brilliant insights, while my carefully researched proposals were filed away and forgotten. During my second year of community college, I decided to take a part-time job at Ocean View, the upscale restaurant across town that was consistently booked solid and had a waiting list for weekend reservations. I told my parents I wanted to see how other restaurants operated, but the real reason was that I was desperate to work somewhere that appreciated competence and rewarded hard work. The contrast was immediate and eye-opening. Ocean View operated with military precision, every staff member knew their role and executed it flawlessly, and the management team made decisions based on data rather than tradition. The head chef, Marcus Rivera, ran the kitchen with the kind of organized efficiency that made our chaotic operation at Rosa's look amateur by comparison. The front-of-house manager, Linda Chen, could handle a fully booked Saturday night with grace and professionalism that made Gloria's dramatic flair seem outdated and ineffective. Working at Ocean View 3 nights a week, I learned more about professional restaurant management in 6 months than I had in years of working at my family's place. I saw how proper inventory management could minimize waste, how strategic menu pricing could maximize profits, and how employee training programs could create consistent service quality. Most importantly, I learned that restaurants could be profitable, well-run businesses rather than struggling family obligations. The knowledge I gained at Ocean View made working at Rosa's even more frustrating. I could see exactly what needed to be fixed, but every suggestion I made was met with resistance or indifference. When I proposed implementing a reservation system to better manage busy nights, Gloria insisted that their open-door policy was part of their charm. When I suggested updating their point-of-sale system to track sales data more effectively, Anthony worried about the learning curve for their older staff members. Meanwhile, Michael was finishing his freshman year at the State University, majoring in communications with a minor in business, though his grades were mediocre at best. Despite his lack of real restaurant experience or business knowledge, family conversations about the future of Rosa's always centered around his eventual takeover. It was simply assumed that he would inherit the business, not because he had earned it or demonstrated any particular aptitude for it, but because he was the son. The gender dynamics in my family were traditional in the most limiting ways. Gloria often made comments about how I was so smart and would make some man very happy someday with my organizational skills and work ethic, but it never seemed to occur to her that these same qualities might make me an excellent restaurant owner. Anthony praised my reliability and dedication but spoke about the future of the business as if I were a temporary employee rather than a daughter who had invested years of her life in making the place run smoothly. Family gatherings became increasingly difficult as I watched my parents plan for a future that didn't include me in any meaningful way. They would discuss renovation plans, menu changes, and expansion possibilities with Michael, asking for his input on decisions that would affect the business he would supposedly inherit. Meanwhile, I was expected to serve dinner, clean up afterward, and listen to these conversations as an outsider. The breaking point started building during the spring of my second year at community college. Michael came home for spring break and announced that he wanted to spend the summer working at Rosa's to get serious about learning the family business. Our parents were thrilled, treating this as evidence of his maturity and commitment, even though I had been working there seriously for years without any such recognition. That summer became a masterclass in favoritism and gender bias. Michael was immediately given a position as assistant manager, a title that had never existed before and came with responsibilities that mostly involved greeting customers and handling the register during busy periods. I, despite having more experience and knowledge than he did, remained in my unofficial role as general problem solver and backup for every department. The most insulting part was watching Gloria introduce Michael to customers and business contacts as my son who's learning to run the family business, while I was either ignored entirely or mentioned as our daughter who helps out. The difference in language was subtle but significant. He was learning to run the business, I was just helping out. Michael's lack of real restaurant knowledge became apparent quickly, but instead of acknowledging this, our parents covered for his mistakes and credited me with his successes. When he accidentally ordered twice as much produce as we needed, resulting in significant waste, Anthony blamed the supplier for a miscommunication. When I created a new system for organizing the walk-in cooler that improved efficiency and reduced spoilage, Michael got praised for his innovative thinking. The financial reality of Rosa's became clearer to me that summer as I took on more administrative responsibilities. We were barely breaking even most months, and only family labor was keeping us afloat. The building needed significant repairs, the equipment was failing regularly, and our customer base was aging out without being replaced by younger diners. Without major changes, the restaurant would likely close within a few years. I spent weeks developing a comprehensive business plan that addressed our most pressing issues. I researched successful restaurant turnarounds, analyzed our local competition, and created detailed proposals for menu updates, marketing strategies, and operational improvements. I calculated the costs of necessary renovations, projected the potential return on investment, and outlined a timeline for implementation. When I presented this plan to my parents, suggesting that we needed to modernize or face closure, their response was polite but dismissive. Anthony thanked me for my homework, but explained that they preferred to make changes gradually. Gloria worried that my proposals were too radical and might alienate their existing customers. Neither of them seemed to grasp the urgency of our situation or the potential of my suggestions. The most devastating part of their response was when Anthony suggested that I was thinking too much like a student and needed to understand that real business was different from textbook theories. This came from a man whose business was failing specifically because he refused to apply basic business principles to his operations. My education and outside experience, which should have been assets, were being dismissed as irrelevant academic theory. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As summer ended and Michael returned to college, I realized that my role in the family business would never change, regardless of my competence or dedication. I would always be the reliable helper, never the leader. My ideas would always be considered interesting but impractical, while Michael's casual observations would be treated as wisdom. My future was apparently to be a supporting player in a business that I understood better than anyone else in my family. The realization was crushing because I genuinely loved the restaurant industry. Working at Ocean View had shown me how exciting and rewarding it could be to run a successful food service operation. I enjoyed the fast pace, the creativity required for menu development, the challenge of managing multiple departments simultaneously, and the satisfaction of creating experiences that brought people together. But I was never going to be able to pursue these interests at Rosa's, not in any meaningful way. That fall, I started my final year at community college with a new sense of purpose. Instead of focusing on how I could improve my family's restaurant, I began thinking about what my own future in the industry might look like. I took additional courses in entrepreneurship and small business management, networked with other restaurant professionals in the area, and started seriously considering what it would take to open my own place someday. My parents noticed the change in my attitude but misinterpreted it entirely. When I stopped volunteering suggestions for improving Rosa's operations, they assumed I was finally learning to respect their experience and wisdom. When I reduced my hours at the restaurant to focus on my studies and my job at Ocean View, they praised me for becoming more balanced and not being so obsessed with work. The irony was painful. They were relieved that I was stepping back from the business I had been trying to save, while simultaneously expressing concern about its future. Once Michael graduated and hopefully brought fresh ideas to the operation, they couldn't see that the fresh ideas they needed were coming from their daughter, not their son, and that by dismissing my contributions, they were losing their best chance for success. During my final semester, I received an offer to continue working at Ocean View full-time after graduation, with the possibility of advancing to a management position within a year. Linda Chen had been impressed with my work ethic and my understanding of restaurant operations, and she saw potential in me that my own family had never recognized. The offer included a salary that was significantly more than I could ever expect to earn at Rosa's, along with benefits and opportunities for professional development. At the same time, Michael was struggling with his junior year of college, his grades slipping as he spent more time socializing than studying. Despite his academic troubles, family conversations still revolved around his eventual return to run Rosa's. The contrast between his opportunities and mine could not have been more stark, and it had nothing to do with our relative qualifications or dedication. The decision to accept the full-time position at Ocean View felt like both a liberation and a betrayal. I was excited about the opportunity to advance my career and learn from successful restaurant professionals, but I also felt guilty about abandoning my family's struggling business. The guilt was complicated by the knowledge that they had never really seen me as essential to their success anyway. When I told my parents about the job offer, their response revealed everything about how they viewed my role in the family. Instead of recognizing it as an opportunity for their highly qualified daughter to advance her career, they saw it as a potential inconvenience to their operations. Gloria worried about who would handle the administrative tasks I had been managing, while Anthony expressed concern about losing my reliable help during busy periods. Neither of them congratulated me on the offer or expressed pride in my professional achievement. There was no acknowledgement that a respected restaurant was offering me a management track position based on my demonstrated abilities. Instead, they treated it as a personal decision that might negatively impact them, rather than a professional milestone that deserved celebration. The conversation that followed was one of the most revealing of my entire life. When I explained that I was seriously considering accepting the position, Gloria asked why I would want to work for someone else when I could continue helping with the family business. When I mentioned the salary and benefits, Anthony suggested that money wasn't everything and that family should come first. When I pointed out that I had been putting family first for years without receiving recognition or opportunities for advancement, they seemed genuinely surprised by my perspective. The disconnect was so complete that it was almost comical. They had spent years taking my contributions for granted while investing all their hopes and expectations in Michael, but they were shocked that I might want to pursue my own professional goals elsewhere. They seemed to believe that I should be grateful for the opportunity to work indefinitely in a subordinate role at a struggling business, simply because it was a family business. That conversation crystallized something that had been building in my mind for months. My family didn't see me as a potential leader or business owner. They saw me as a reliable employee who worked for free. They didn't value my education, my experience, or my ideas. They valued my willingness to do whatever needed to be done without complaint. They didn't envision a future where I might have my own ambitions. They assumed I would always be available to support Michael's dreams. I accepted the position at Ocean View, effective 2 weeks after my graduation from community college. The decision felt like stepping off a cliff, not because I was afraid of the new job, but because I was finally acknowledging that my future lay outside my family's plans. For the first time in my life, I was choosing my own professional path, rather than defaulting to what my family expected from me. The 2 weeks between accepting the job and starting it were filled with family drama that I should have anticipated but somehow didn't. Gloria oscillated between passive-aggressive comments about my abandonment of the family and worried questions about how they would manage without my help. Anthony expressed disappointment that I was giving up on the family business just when Michael would be ready to take over and could benefit from my support. The assumption that I should subordinate my career goals to support Michael's inheritance was so ingrained in their thinking that they couldn't understand why I found it objectionable. In their minds, this was simply how families worked. Everyone supported the designated heir, regardless of their own qualifications or ambitions. The fact that the designated heir was chosen based on gender rather than merit apparently didn't factor into their calculations. Michael's reaction to my career change was the most hurtful of all. Instead of congratulating me or acknowledging that I might be better suited for restaurant management than he was, he expressed concern about how my departure would affect his transition into the business. He worried that he would have to learn all the operational details that I had been handling, as if this was an unreasonable burden rather than a basic requirement for running a restaurant. His response revealed how much he had been counting on my continued presence to compensate for his own lack of knowledge and experience. He had apparently assumed that I would always be there to handle the difficult aspects of the business while he focused on the more enjoyable parts of being the owner. The possibility that I might have my own career aspirations had never seriously occurred to him. The family dynamics that I had accepted as normal for so many years suddenly seemed insane. I was the most qualified person in my family to run a restaurant, but I was expected to step aside so that my less qualified brother could inherit the business. I had invested years of my life in making Rosa's run smoothly, but my departure was treated as a selfish abandonment rather than a natural career progression. I had demonstrated competence and dedication that exceeded anything Michael had shown, but he was still considered the obvious choice for leadership. My last day working at Rosa's was emotionally complicated in ways I hadn't expected. I felt sadness about leaving a place that had been central to my life for so many years, but I also felt relief about escaping a situation where my contributions would never be fully valued. I felt guilt about potentially making things harder for my family, but I also felt excitement about finally pursuing my own professional goals. The goodbye dinner my parents organized was well-intentioned but painful. They invited extended family and longtime customers to celebrate my new adventure, treating it like a going-away party rather than a career advancement. The language they used consistently framed my departure as leaving rather than moving forward, as if I was abandoning something important rather than pursuing something better. During the dinner, multiple relatives made comments about how they hoped I would eventually come back to help the family business once I had gotten this experience out of my system. The assumption that my new job was a temporary phase rather than a serious career move revealed how little they understood about my professional ambitions. They still saw me as someone who would ultimately prioritize family obligations over personal success. The most telling moment came when Uncle Tony, my father's brother, made a toast about how lucky Michael was to have such a dedicated sister who would always be there to support him. The toast was meant to be complimentary, but it perfectly captured the family's expectations. I was valuable primarily as a support system for Michael's success, not as an individual with my own potential for achievement. As I started my new position at Ocean View, I felt like I was finally able to breathe freely for the first time in years. The contrast between working in a professional environment where competence was recognized and working in a family business where it was taken for granted was immediate and stark. Linda Chin treated me as a valued team member whose opinions mattered, while Marcus Rivera welcomed my questions and encouraged me to learn every aspect of the operation. The learning curve was steep but exhilarating. Ocean View operated at a level of sophistication that made Rosa's seem amateurish by comparison. Everything from the inventory management system to the staff scheduling software was designed for maximum efficiency and profitability. The attention to detail in food preparation, service standards, and customer experience was unlike anything I had experienced in my family's restaurant. Within my first month, I was contributing ideas that were not only welcomed but implemented. My suggestions for streamlining the prep work schedule saved the kitchen staff several hours per week, and my proposal for reorganizing the wine storage system improved both efficiency and sales tracking. The positive reception of my contributions was validating in ways that years of work at Rosa's had never been. The financial compensation was equally revelatory. For the first time in my adult life, I was earning enough money to live independently, save for my future, and even enjoy occasional luxuries without feeling guilty. The regular paycheck, health benefits, and paid vacation time made me realize how much I had been sacrificing by working for my family's restaurant essentially for free. Most importantly, I was working with people who shared my passion for the restaurant industry and my commitment to excellence. The conversations during staff meetings were about improving operations, enhancing customer experience, and growing the business, rather than maintaining traditions or avoiding change. The forward-thinking approach was energizing and made me even more aware of how stagnant the atmosphere at Rosa's had become. As I settled into my new role, I began to understand what my career trajectory might look like in a professional environment. Linda had mentioned the possibility of management training within a year, and Marcus had expressed interest in teaching me more about menu development and kitchen operations. For the first time, I could envision a future where my restaurant industry knowledge and passion would lead to genuine leadership opportunities. The contrast with my family's expectations for my future could not have been more dramatic. At Rosa's, my ceiling was basically to remain a helpful daughter who could be counted on to handle whatever needed doing. At Ocean View, my potential was limited only by my own ambition and ability to learn. The difference was transformative and made me realize how much I had been undervaluing myself for years. 6 months into my new job, I was promoted to assistant manager, a position that came with additional responsibilities, a significant raise, and the opportunity to work directly with the ownership group on strategic planning. The promotion was based purely on my performance and potential, without any consideration of family relationships or gender expectations. The meritocratic environment was something I had never experienced before, and it was incredibly motivating. Around the same time, I heard through the local restaurant network that Rosa's was struggling even more than usual. Without my free labor and administrative support, the operational problems I had been quietly solving for years had become visible and problematic. Michael had returned from college for the summer but was apparently overwhelmed by the complexity of actually running the business rather than just being the designated heir. The news should have made me feel guilty or worried about my family's situation, but instead it mostly made me feel validated. My contributions to Rosa's had been more significant than anyone had acknowledged, and my departure had revealed just how much value I had been providing without recognition. The struggling business was proof that my skills and dedication had been essential, even if my family had never treated them as such. The most satisfying aspect of my success at Ocean View was the respect I earned from other professionals in the local restaurant community. Word traveled quickly in the tight-knit network of food service professionals, and my rapid advancement at one of the most successful restaurants in town enhanced my reputation significantly. Other restaurant owners and managers began to know me by name and to seek out my opinions on industry trends and best practices. This professional recognition was something I had never experienced while working at Rosa's, where I was known primarily as Anthony's daughter rather than as an individual with her own expertise. The shift from being identified by my family relationships to being recognized for my professional achievements felt like stepping into my own identity for the first time. As my first year at Ocean View drew to a close, Linda began talking seriously about my potential for advancement within the company and in the industry more broadly. She suggested that I consider pursuing additional education in hospitality management and mentioned connections she had with restaurant owners who might be interested in hiring experienced managers. For the first time, I was having conversations about my career that focused on my potential rather than my willingness to support someone else's dreams. The transformation in my life was so complete that I sometimes felt like I was living someone else's story. A year earlier, I had been working for free at my family's struggling restaurant, watching my less qualified brother get positioned as the future owner while my contributions were taken for granted. Now I was earning a professional salary, advancing based on merit, and being encouraged to pursue leadership opportunities in an industry I loved. The contrast crystallized everything I had lost by accepting my family's limited expectations for so many years, but it also highlighted everything I stood to gain by continuing to prioritize my own professional development. The choice between family loyalty and personal ambition, which had once seemed impossible, now felt obvious. I was finally building the career I had always wanted, and I wasn't going to let anyone convince me to give it up again. But as satisfied as I was with my professional progress, I knew that my relationship with my family remained unresolved. We maintained polite contact, but there was an underlying tension about my career choices that had never been directly addressed. They were proud of my success in the abstract, but they also seemed to view it as a temporary phase that would eventually end with my return to help with Rosa's. The collision between my new life and my family's expectations was inevitable, and it would come sooner than I anticipated. When it did, it would force me to choose definitively between the future I was building for myself and the role my family still expected me to play. The confrontation would be more dramatic and hurtful than anything I could have imagined, but it would also finally free me to become who I was meant to be. The invitation to my cousin Elena's wedding arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, exactly 14 months after I had started working at Ocean View. The elegant ivory cardstock announced that the reception would be held at Rosa's Italian kitchen, which immediately made my stomach tighten with anxiety. I hadn't set foot in my family's restaurant since my goodbye dinner over a year ago, and the thought of returning for such a significant family event felt loaded with potential conflict. Elena was my father's sister's daughter, and we had grown up together attending the same family gatherings, sharing holidays, and maintaining the kind of casual closeness that comes from being roughly the same age in a large extended family. Her decision to hold her wedding reception at Rosa's was both sentimental and practical. The restaurant had always been the centerpiece of family celebrations, and she was getting a significant discount on the venue rental by keeping the event in the family. When I called to RSVP, my mother answered the phone with the kind of forced cheerfulness that immediately put me on guard. She seemed genuinely pleased to hear from me but also nervous in a way that suggested she had been dreading this conversation. We talked for a few minutes about the wedding details, the menu they were planning, and how excited everyone was for the celebration, but underneath the pleasantries was an undercurrent of tension that neither of us acknowledged directly. The conversation took an uncomfortable turn when Gloria mentioned how busy they had been preparing for the event and how much extra work it was creating for their small staff. The implication was clear: they could use my help, just like old times. When I didn't volunteer to assist with the preparations, she shifted to talking about how much the family missed seeing me and how rare it had become for everyone to be together in one place. I agreed to attend the reception without offering to help with the setup or service, which felt strange and selfish but also necessary. My role at Ocean View had taught me the importance of maintaining professional boundaries, and I was determined not to slip back into the old pattern of automatically volunteering for family obligations that would go unappreciated. The decision felt both mature and painful, like many aspects of my evolving relationship with my family. The weeks leading up to the wedding were filled with phone calls from various relatives who seemed excited about the prospect of seeing me again after such a long absence. Most of these conversations followed a similar pattern: genuine warmth and curiosity about my new job, followed by subtle questions about whether I missed working at Rosa's and gentle suggestions that I should consider helping out more often. The family members meant well, but their comments revealed how little they understood about my professional growth or my reasons for leaving. Aunt Maria, Elena's mother, was particularly insistent that I should arrive early to help with the setup, since I knew the restaurant so well and could be useful in making sure everything went smoothly. Her request was framed as a special favor for the bride, but it felt like an attempt to pull me back into the old dynamic where my time and energy were automatically available for family needs. When I politely declined, explaining that I had work commitments that day, her disappointment was obvious even over the phone. The pressure to contribute to the wedding preparations intensified as the date approached. Michael, who was now technically managing Rosa's while finishing his final semester of college, called to ask for my advice about several logistical challenges they were facing. The questions he asked revealed just how much he still didn't understand. about running the restaurant, and his tone suggested that he expected me to solve these problems for him, just as I always had in the past. His call put me in an impossible position. I genuinely wanted Elena's wedding to be successful, and I could see exactly how to fix the problems Michael was describing, but I also knew that helping him would reinforce the family's assumption that I was always available to bail them out when things got difficult. I provided some general guidance over the phone but stopped short of offering hands-on assistance, a compromise that left both of us feeling unsatisfied. The most revealing conversation came from my father, who called a few days before the wedding to discuss what he described as logistics, but was really a request for me to work during the reception. He explained that they would be short-staffed due to the size of the event and suggested that it would be natural for me to help out, since I was family and knew how everything worked. The casualness of his assumption that I would work during my cousin's wedding reception was stunning, even though I should have expected it. When I reminded him that I was attending as a guest, not as an employee, his confusion was genuine. He seemed unable to understand why I wouldn't want to help ensure the event went smoothly, as if my desire to attend the wedding as a normal family member rather than as unpaid labor was selfish or unreasonable. The conversation ended awkwardly, with both of us frustrated by the other's perspective. The night before the wedding, I spent extra time choosing my outfit, settling on a navy blue dress that was elegant but not too formal, professional but not severe. I wanted to look successful and confident without appearing to be making a statement about my new life. The careful consideration I gave to my appearance reflected how nervous I was about the entire evening and how much I wanted to project the right image to my extended family. Elena's wedding ceremony was beautiful, held at the small Catholic church where most of our family had been married over the years. Seeing her in her grandmother's vintage lace dress, exchanging vows with her college sweetheart David, reminded me of all the traditions and connections that still mattered to me despite my complicated relationship with my immediate family. The ceremony itself was joyful and uncomplicated, a reminder of why I had wanted to attend despite my reservations about the reception. The real test came afterward, when the entire wedding party and all the guests made their way to Rosa's for the reception. Walking into the restaurant felt like stepping back in time, not because anything had changed dramatically, but because I was seeing it with completely different eyes. The dining room that had once felt familiar and comfortable now seemed dated and cramped compared to the sleek professionalism of Ocean View. The service style that I had once considered adequate now appeared disorganized and amateur. My parents were bustling around the dining room, trying to manage the event while also playing their roles as hosts and family members. The stress was visible on their faces, and I could see immediately that they were overwhelmed by the complexity of serving a formal dinner for 60 people with their limited staff and outdated systems. Part of me wanted to jump in and help, but I forced myself to remain in my seat and act like a normal guest. Michael was clearly struggling to coordinate the service, moving frantically between the kitchen and dining room while trying to maintain a calm exterior for the wedding guests. His inexperience was obvious to anyone who understood restaurant operations, and I watched him make several small mistakes that would have been easily avoidable with proper planning and preparation. The temptation to offer guidance was strong, but I reminded myself that this was no longer my responsibility. The first hour of the reception proceeded smoothly enough, with cocktails and appetizers served at a reasonable pace despite some minor delays. I found myself seated at a table with other cousins and family friends, enjoying conversations that had nothing to do with the restaurant business or my career choices. For a brief period, I was able to relax and simply enjoy being part of a family celebration. The problems began to emerge during the transition from cocktail hour to dinner service. It became apparent that the kitchen was running behind schedule, and the servers were struggling to coordinate the proper timing for a formal, sit-down meal. I could see the panic beginning to set in among the staff, and I noticed my parents having urgent, whispered conversations near the kitchen entrance. The delay stretched longer than was comfortable, and wedding guests began to look restless and confused about when they would be called to dinner. Elena and David maintained their gracious smiles, but I could see the bride's growing concern as it became obvious that something was going wrong with the service. The situation was developing into exactly the kind of crisis that I would have prevented or quickly resolved during my years of working at Rosa's. Aunt Maria approached my parents with obvious worry, asking about the dinner timeline and whether there was anything she could do to help. I watched my mother's face as she tried to reassure Maria while clearly feeling overwhelmed by the situation. The conversation ended with both women looking in my direction, and I realized they were discussing whether to ask for my assistance. Michael appeared at my table looking frazzled and desperate, his confident facade completely abandoned in favor of obvious panic. He leaned down and spoke quietly, asking if I could just take a quick look at the situation in the kitchen and maybe offer some suggestions for getting things back on track. His request was framed as a small favor, but I could see that he was in over his head and looking for me to solve problems that he couldn't handle. The wedding guests were beginning to murmur among themselves about the delay, and I could see Elena's parents exchanging worried glances across the room. The situation was rapidly deteriorating from a minor service delay into a potential disaster that would ruin my cousin's wedding reception. The pressure to intervene was enormous, especially since I knew I could fix the problems quickly and efficiently. I politely declined Michael's request, explaining that I was attending as a guest and suggesting that he should focus on communicating with the kitchen staff about realistic timing for dinner service. My refusal clearly surprised him, and his expression shifted from hope to confusion to something that looked like betrayal. He had apparently assumed that family loyalty would override my decision to maintain boundaries, regardless of how I had been treated in the past. As the delay stretched past 40 minutes, my father approached my table with the kind of serious expression that indicated he was about to make a formal request rather than a casual suggestion. He pulled up an empty chair and sat down beside me, lowering his voice so that the other guests couldn't hear our conversation. His approach was more respectful than Michael's had been, but the underlying assumption was the same: I should step in to save the situation. Anthony explained that they were facing a crisis in the kitchen coordination and that the entire reception was at risk of falling apart unless someone with experience could help get things organized. He acknowledged that it wasn't fair to ask me to work during a family event, but he emphasized that this was an emergency situation that threatened to ruin Elena's special day. His appeal was calculated to trigger my sense of family responsibility and my affection for my cousin. The request put me in an impossible position. I genuinely cared about Elena and wanted her wedding reception to be successful, but I also knew that helping out would send the message that I was still available to bail out my family whenever they needed me. More importantly, it would undermine the professional boundaries I had worked so hard to establish and would likely lead to future expectations that I would always be willing to step in during crises. I told my father that I was sorry about the situation, but that I was attending the reception as a guest, not as an employee, and that I thought it would be inappropriate for me to work during my cousin's wedding. I suggested that he should focus on communicating realistic expectations to the guests and work with the existing staff to get dinner service back on track, even if it meant simplifying the planned menu or service style. His reaction was immediate and intense. The diplomatic tone he had used for his initial request disappeared, replaced by frustration and something that looked like genuine anger. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, and looked down at me with an expression I had never seen directed at me before. The conversation that followed would change our relationship forever. Anthony's voice was low but clearly audible to the other people at my table when he said that he couldn't believe I would sit there watching my own family struggle when I had the ability to help. He pointed out that the restaurant had provided for me for years, that I had learned everything I knew about the business by working there, and that family loyalty should mean something when people were in real trouble. His words were designed to shame me into compliance, and they were delivered with enough force to make the nearby tables turn their attention to our exchange. I responded as calmly as I could, explaining again that I was attending as a guest and that it wouldn't be appropriate for me to work during the reception. I pointed out that I hadn't been involved in the planning for this event and that jumping in now would likely create more confusion rather than solving the underlying problems. My rational tone seemed to make him even angrier, as if my refusal to become emotional proved that I didn't care about the family's predicament. The argument attracted the attention of other family members, including my mother, who hurried over to see what was causing the disturbance. Gloria's arrival made the situation more complicated because she immediately tried to mediate between Anthony and me while also making her own case for why I should help. Her approach was more emotional than my father's, focusing on how much the family had missed me and how this could be an opportunity for us to work together again like old times. Michael joined the group, adding his voice to the pressure campaign by emphasizing how much stress everyone was under and how quickly I could resolve the crisis if I would just be willing to help for a few hours. His tone suggested that my refusal was unreasonable and selfish, especially since the solution was so simple and the need was so urgent. The combined pressure from all three of them was intense, and I could feel the eyes of other wedding guests watching our family drama unfold. The conversation escalated when I attempted to explain my perspective about professional boundaries and my role as a guest rather than an employee. My explanation was interrupted by my father, who dismissed my concerns as ridiculous and self-important. He suggested that I had let my new job go to my head and that I was using fancy business concepts to justify abandoning my family when they needed me most. Gloria's contribution to the argument was perhaps the most hurtful because it targeted my character rather than just my actions. She suggested that I had become cold and calculating since leaving Rosa's, more concerned with my own image than with family relationships. She wondered aloud when I had become the type of person who would watch a family celebration fall apart rather than lending a helping hand to people who had sacrificed so much for me over the years. The accusations stung because they contained just enough truth to be believable. I had become more professional and more focused on boundaries since starting my job at Ocean View, and I was less willing to automatically prioritize family needs over my own interests. But framing these changes as character flaws rather than personal growth felt deeply unfair, especially since my family had never shown much appreciation for my previous willingness to sacrifice for their benefit. Michael's contribution to the confrontation was the most revealing because it exposed the underlying assumptions that had always governed our family dynamics. He expressed genuine confusion about why I was being difficult, when all they needed was a few hours of my help to save the reception. His tone suggested that my refusal was not just unhelpful but incomprehensible, as if the idea that I might have my own reasons for declining was literally beyond his understanding. When I tried to explain that I had made a conscious decision to attend as a guest rather than working at family events, Michael interrupted to point out that family businesses required flexibility and that everyone had to pitch in during emergencies. His comment revealed that he still viewed me primarily as a family employee rather than as an independent adult with my own priorities and boundaries. The argument reached its peak when my father accused me of using the wedding reception as an opportunity to make a point about my independence rather than simply helping family members who were in trouble. He suggested that my refusal to work was more about proving something to myself than about maintaining professional boundaries, and that I was willing to ruin Elena's special day to make a statement about my new priorities. The accusation was particularly painful because it suggested that my decision was motivated by spite rather than principle. Anthony seemed to believe that I was punishing the family for past slights rather than simply trying to maintain healthy boundaries in my current relationships. His interpretation of my motives revealed how little he understood about my personal growth or my reasons for changing my approach to family obligations. The confrontation was taking place in front of dozens of wedding guests, including extended family members who were clearly uncomfortable with the public nature of our dispute. I could see Elena and David trying to maintain their composure while obviously distressed by the drama that was overshadowing their reception. The realization that our argument was ruining my cousin's wedding made me feel terrible, but it also strengthened my resolve not to give in to the pressure. Gloria's final attempt to convince me involved bringing up specific memories from my childhood and adolescence, reminding me of times when the family had come together to support each other during difficult periods. She talked about how proud they had always been of my work ethic and reliability, and how disappointed they were to discover that those qualities apparently didn't extend to helping family members during genuine emergencies. Her emotional appeal was designed to trigger guilt about abandoning family values, but it also highlighted the fundamental disconnect between her perspective and mine. She was remembering my past willingness to sacrifice as evidence of my character, while I was viewing my current boundaries as evidence of my growth. We were operating from completely different assumptions about what family loyalty should look like in practice. The breaking point came when my mother made a comment that revealed the depth of her disappointment in the person I had become since leaving Rosa's. She said that she didn't recognize the daughter who would sit at a family celebration, watching relatives struggle when she had the power to help. Her words suggested that my professional development had somehow damaged my fundamental character, turning me into someone less caring and generous than I had been before. The comment was devastating because it framed my personal growth as moral deterioration. Instead of recognizing that I had developed better boundaries and a stronger sense of self-worth, Gloria saw only that I was less willing to automatically sacrifice my own interests for family needs. Her perspective made it clear that she valued my willingness to be used more than she valued my happiness or professional success. Anthony's response to my continued refusal was swift and final. His frustration with my position and his embarrassment about the public nature of our argument seemed to combine into a moment of complete rejection. Looking directly at me with an expression of disgust and disappointment that I will never forget, he said the words that would end our relationship as I had always known it. He told me that if I wasn't willing to help my own family during a crisis, then maybe I shouldn't consider myself part of the family at all. He suggested that since I was so concerned with being treated like a regular guest rather than a family member, perhaps I should find somewhere else to sit where I wouldn't have to be bothered by family obligations. His voice was loud enough that most of the reception guests could hear him clearly, making his rejection of me a public humiliation. The moment stretched out like a scene from a nightmare, with dozens of wedding guests staring at us in shocked silence while I processed the reality of what my father had just said. He had essentially disowned me in front of our entire extended family because I had refused to work during my cousin's wedding reception. The rejection was so extreme and so public that it felt surreal, like something that happened to other people rather than something that could happen to me. Gloria's reaction to Anthony's statement was immediate but not what I had hoped for. Instead of defending me or suggesting that he had gone too far, she simply looked at me with an expression that seemed to say that this was my choice and my fault. Her silence in the face of my father's rejection felt like her own form of abandonment, confirming that both of my parents were willing to cut me off rather than accept my decision to maintain boundaries. Michael's response was perhaps the most painful because it revealed how completely he had absorbed the family's perspective about my role and value. Instead of being shocked by our father's harsh words, he nodded in agreement and suggested that if I didn't want to be part of the family business, then maybe I shouldn't expect to be treated like family at all. His willingness to support my exile over such a relatively minor disagreement showed how little our sibling relationship meant to him. The silence that followed was deafening, with wedding guests staring at our family in obvious discomfort while Elena and David looked on in horror at the scene that was ruining their reception. I could see Aunt Maria trying to decide whether to intervene, while other relatives exchanged meaningful glances about the drama they were witnessing. The entire situation had spiraled far beyond anything that could be easily repaired. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling unsteady as the full implications of what had just happened began to sink in. My own father had just publicly disowned me in front of our entire extended family because I had refused to work during a wedding reception. The punishment was so disproportionate to the offense that it revealed something fundamental about how my family viewed my worth and my role in their lives. Looking around the dining room at the faces of relatives who had known me since childhood, I realized that this moment would define how they understood my relationship with my immediate family going forward. Some looked sympathetic, others appeared confused or uncomfortable, but none of them spoke up to defend me or to suggest that my father's reaction was unreasonable. Their silence felt like a confirmation that the family had collectively decided I was in the wrong. Elena approached our group with obvious distress, clearly torn between her loyalty to different family members and her desire to salvage her wedding reception. She tried to mediate by suggesting that everyone was stressed and saying things they didn't mean, but her attempt at peacekeeping only highlighted how seriously the situation had deteriorated. The fact that my cousin felt compelled to referee a family dispute during her own wedding reception made me feel even worse about the entire situation. I made the decision to leave quietly rather than escalating the confrontation further. Looking directly at my father, I told him that I understood his position and that I would respect his wishes about not considering myself part of the family. My words were calm and dignified, but they also made clear that I was accepting his rejection rather than begging for forgiveness or promising to change my behavior. The walk to the exit felt endless, with every step taking me past wedding guests who were staring at the spectacle of my family's public breakdown. I could hear whispered conversations starting up behind me as relatives began processing what they had just witnessed and forming their own opinions about who was right and who was wrong. The embarrassment was overwhelming, but it was accompanied by a strange sense of relief about finally understanding exactly where I stood with my family. My mother called my name as I reached the door, and for a moment I thought she might be coming to apologize or to try to repair the damage that had been done. When I turned around, however, she simply said that she hoped I was satisfied with myself and that I could live with the consequences of my choices. Her final words to me were not an attempt at reconciliation but a confirmation that she supported my father's decision to reject me. I walked out of Rosa's Italian kitchen for what I knew would be the last time, leaving behind not just my family's restaurant but my role as the dutiful daughter who could always be counted on to sacrifice her own needs for the greater good. The October air was crisp and clean after the stuffy atmosphere of the dining room, and I stood in the parking lot for several minutes trying to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. The drive home was surreal, with my mind replaying the confrontation and trying to understand how a disagreement about working during a wedding reception had escalated into a complete family rupture. The disproportionate nature of my father's reaction suggested that this had never really been about the wedding crisis but about larger issues of control, respect, and my changing role within the family dynamics. Back in my apartment, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and tried to make sense of the evening's events. The rejection hurt more than I had expected, but it was also clarifying in a way that felt almost liberating. My family's reaction to my boundaries had revealed exactly how they viewed me and what they expected from our relationships. Their willingness to disown me rather than accept my professional growth showed that they had never really seen me as an independent adult with my own legitimate needs and priorities. The most painful realization was that my family's love had always been conditional on my willingness to subordinate my own interests to theirs. As long as I was willing to work for free, sacrifice my own opportunities, and prioritize their needs above my own, I was valued and appreciated. The moment I began asserting boundaries and expecting reciprocal respect, I became a problem to be eliminated rather than a person to be understood. Over the following days, I waited for phone calls from family members who might want to apologize or try to repair the damage that had been done. The silence was complete and telling. No one reached out to suggest that my father had overreacted, no one expressed concern about my well-being, and no one seemed interested in understanding my perspective or working toward reconciliation. The message was clear: I had been erased from the family as completely as if I had never existed. The only contact came from Elena, who called a few days after the wedding to apologize for the scene that had ruined her reception and to express her sadness about what had happened between me and my parents. Her call was kind and well-intentioned, but it also revealed that even she didn't fully understand why I had been unwilling to help or why my father's reaction had been so extreme. The family narrative about my selfishness and abandonment was already becoming established. The weeks that followed were emotionally challenging as I grieved not just the loss of my family relationships but also the loss of my illusions about what those relationships had really meant. I had spent years believing that my family's love was unconditional and that our bonds were strong enough to survive disagreements and changes. The speed and completeness of their rejection showed me that I had been mistaken about the fundamental nature of our connections. But alongside the grief was a growing sense of freedom and possibility that I hadn't expected. For the first time in my adult life, I was completely free to make decisions based on my own needs and priorities without worrying about family obligations or expectations. The weight of constantly trying to balance my own interests with family demands was gone, replaced by the clarity that comes from knowing exactly where you stand. My work at Ocean View became even more important as I channeled my emotional energy into professional growth and achievement. Linda noticed the change in my focus and intensity, and she began giving me additional responsibilities and opportunities that accelerated my development as a restaurant manager. The validation I received from succeeding in a meritocratic environment helped offset the pain of losing my family's approval. The contrast between my professional relationships and my family relationships became even more stark in the aftermath of the wedding confrontation. At Ocean View, my value was based on my contributions and my potential, while at Rosa's it had been based on my willingness to be exploited. The difference was so obvious that I wondered how I had tolerated the family dynamic for so many years, without recognizing how unhealthy it was. 3 months after the wedding, I heard through the local restaurant network that Rosa's was struggling more than ever and that my family was considering selling the business. The news should have made me feel vindicated or worried, but instead it mostly made me feel sad about opportunities that had been wasted and potential that had been squandered. My family had chosen to lose both their daughter and their business, rather than adapt to changing circumstances or acknowledge their own limitations. The final chapter of my relationship with Rosa's came when Linda mentioned that the restaurant was officially for sale and that several investors were considering purchasing it as a redevelopment opportunity. The building would likely be demolished to make way for a modern commercial development, erasing the last physical traces of my family's legacy and my own history with the place. I felt no temptation to intervene or to try to save the restaurant that had once been such a central part of my life. That chapter was closed, and I was focused entirely on building my own future in an industry that valued competence and rewarded ambition. The little girl who had dreamed of someday running her family's restaurant was gone, replaced by a professional who understood that the best opportunities often come from unexpected directions. The transformation was complete, but the most important changes were still to come. The Monday morning after Elena's wedding, I walked into Ocean View with a clarity I had never experienced before. The complete severance from my family's expectations felt like emerging from underwater and finally being able to breathe freely. Linda noticed immediately that something fundamental had shifted in my demeanor, though she was too professional to pry into my personal life without an invitation. The first few weeks were emotionally turbulent as I processed the magnitude of what had happened. Some days I felt liberated and energized by my newfound freedom from family obligations. Other days I felt hollow and disoriented, as if a fundamental part of my identity had been surgically removed. The grieving process was complicated by the fact that I was mourning relationships that had been more illusion than reality, built on conditions I had never fully understood. Dr. Patricia Kimmel, the therapist I started seeing during this period, helped me understand that what I was experiencing was actually quite common among people who had been raised in families with rigid role expectations. She explained that my family's reaction to my boundaries was predictable given their investment in maintaining the existing power structure. My refusal to continue playing my assigned role had threatened the entire system they had built around my compliance. The therapy sessions were revelatory in ways I hadn't anticipated. Dr. Kimmel introduced me to concepts like emotional enmeshment and parentification that gave me language for experiences I had never been able to articulate. She helped me understand That my role as the family problem solver had been established when I was too young to consent to it, and that my recent boundary setting was actually a healthy developmental milestone rather than a character flaw. Understanding the psychological dynamics of my family relationships was intellectually helpful, but the emotional healing took much longer. I had to learn how to make decisions without constantly calculating their impact on other people's feelings. I had to practice saying no to requests without providing elaborate justifications. Most importantly, I had to develop a sense of my own worth that wasn't dependent on my usefulness to others. The professional environment at Ocean View became my laboratory for practicing these new behaviors. When Linda asked if I could work extra shifts during busy periods, I learned to consider my own schedule and energy levels before automatically agreeing. When Marcus requested help with inventory during my days off, I evaluated whether the overtime aligned with my personal goals rather than simply feeling obligated to assist. The practice of prioritizing my own needs felt selfish at first, but it gradually became more natural and comfortable. My performance at work improved dramatically as I channeled all the emotional energy I had previously spent managing family relationships into my professional development. Without the constant undercurrent of stress about family dynamics, I was able to focus completely on learning new skills and advancing my career. Linda began assigning me increasingly complex projects that tested my abilities and prepared me for greater leadership responsibilities. The transformation was most visible in my approach to problem solving. Instead of automatically absorbing stress and trying to fix everything myself, I learned to delegate appropriately and work collaboratively with team members. I developed the confidence to voice my opinions during staff meetings and to propose innovative solutions without worrying about stepping on anyone's toes. The leadership skills that had been suppressed in my family environment began to flourish in a setting where they were valued and encouraged. 6 months after the wedding incident, Linda called me into her office for what she described as an important conversation about my future with the company. I had been expecting this discussion for weeks, as she had been dropping hints about upcoming changes in the management structure. When she offered me the position of assistant general manager with a significant salary increase and expanded responsibilities, I felt a surge of pride and validation that was entirely different from the conditional approval I had received from my family. The promotion came with oversight of daily operations, staff scheduling, vendor relationships, and financial reporting. For the first time in my career, I would have real authority to implement changes and make decisions that affected the entire restaurant's performance. The opportunity was exactly what I had been working toward, and it represented a level of professional respect that I had never received at Rosa's despite years of competent service. The new position required additional training in areas like conflict resolution, financial management, and strategic planning. Linda arranged for me to attend a week-long hospitality management seminar in Boston, my first professional conference, and my first time traveling for career development. The experience of being surrounded by successful restaurant professionals who took my ambitions seriously was transformative in ways I couldn't have anticipated. At the conference, I met restaurant owners and managers from across New England who were dealing with challenges similar to those I had observed at Rosa's. The difference was that these professionals approached problems systematically, using data and best practices rather than relying on tradition and instinct. I learned about industry trends, technological innovations, and management strategies that could revolutionize how restaurants operated. The most inspiring part of the conference was meeting other women who had built successful careers in restaurant management and ownership. Their stories of overcoming gender bias and family expectations resonated deeply with my own experiences, and their success proved that the industry could reward competence regardless of traditional assumptions about women's roles. For the first time, I could envision a future where I might own and operate my own restaurant. When I returned from Boston, I threw myself into my new responsibilities with an enthusiasm that surprised even me. The challenges of managing a complex operation were exactly the kind of problems I enjoyed solving, and the authority to implement solutions made the work deeply satisfying. I developed new systems for staff training, improved communication between the kitchen and front-of-house teams, and created reporting mechanisms that gave the ownership group better visibility into daily operations. The results were immediate and measurable. Customer satisfaction scores improved, staff turnover decreased, and profit margins increased as we reduced waste and improved efficiency. More importantly, the entire atmosphere at Ocean View became more professional and collaborative as team members responded to clear expectations and consistent leadership. The success felt earned in a way that my contributions to Rosa's never had. My personal life underwent similar improvements as I learned to apply the same boundary-setting skills to friendships and dating relationships. I started socializing with colleagues from Ocean View and other local restaurants, building a professional network that was both personally and career-wise beneficial. The conversations at these gatherings were stimulating and forward-looking, focused on industry innovations and business opportunities rather than family obligations and old grievances. Dating became more enjoyable as I developed clearer standards for how I expected to be treated in romantic relationships. I no longer felt compelled to accommodate partners who took my time and energy for granted, and I was more selective about investing in relationships that felt reciprocal and supportive. The confidence I had gained professionally translated into better personal relationships across all areas of my life. The most significant relationship development came when I met James Chen, Linda's cousin and a successful chef who was considering opening his own restaurant. James was everything my family had taught me not to expect in a partner. He was impressed by my professional accomplishments, supportive of my career ambitions, and interested in building something together rather than expecting me to support his dreams. Our conversations about restaurant operations and business strategy felt like intellectual partnerships rather than one-sided consultations. James had graduated from culinary school 5 years earlier and had worked in high-end restaurants in Portland and Boston before returning to Maine to be closer to his family. His approach to cooking was innovative but grounded in solid technique, and his business sense was sharp enough to understand the financial realities of restaurant ownership. When he started talking seriously about opening his own place, he naturally included me in his planning discussions. The idea of partnering with James on a restaurant venture was both exciting and terrifying. I had the operational knowledge and management experience that he lacked, while he had the culinary skills and creative vision that would attract customers and critics. Our combined expertise could create something truly special, but the financial risks and personal stakes were enormous. The decision would require me to leave the security of my position at Oceanview and invest my savings in an uncertain venture. Linda was surprisingly supportive when I discussed the opportunity with her. She acknowledged that Oceanview had benefited enormously from my contributions but also recognized that my long-term career goals required opportunities for ownership rather than management. She offered to serve as a reference and mentor as James and I developed our business plan, and she suggested several potential investors who might be interested in backing a promising new restaurant. The business planning process was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Instead of trying to implement improvements within an existing structure that resisted change, James and I were designing everything from scratch according to our vision of what a modern restaurant should be. We researched location options, developed menu concepts, created financial projections, and designed operational systems that incorporated the best practices I had learned throughout my career. The most liberating aspect of planning our own restaurant was the freedom to make decisions based on what would work best rather than what had always been done. We chose a location in the arts district that was attracting young professionals and tourists rather than trying to appeal to the traditional customer base that most family restaurants pursued. We designed a menu that showcased James's culinary creativity while maintaining the profit margins necessary for sustainable operations. The contrast with Rosa's was stark in every aspect of our planning. Where my family's restaurant had been limited by outdated equipment and inefficient layouts, we designed our kitchen for maximum functionality and workflow optimization. Where Rosa's had relied on word-of-mouth marketing and traditional advertising, we developed a comprehensive social media strategy and professional website. Where my family had made decisions based on emotions and traditions, we used market research and financial analysis. Finding investors for our venture required presenting our business plan to several groups of potential backers, a process that tested my professional presentation skills and business knowledge. The meetings were challenging but exhilarating, as I found myself articulating a vision for success that was based on my own expertise and judgment rather than family expectations or inherited traditions. The respect I received from serious businesspeople validated my professional growth in ways that felt deeply meaningful. After 3 months of planning and fundraising, we secured the backing we needed to move forward with our restaurant concept. The investors were impressed with our combined experience, our detailed financial projections, and our realistic understanding of the challenges we would face. More importantly, they believed in our vision of creating a restaurant that would serve exceptional food while operating as a profitable and sustainable business. The process of building out our restaurant space was exhausting but thrilling. Every decision, from the color of the walls to the design of the point-of-sale system, reflected our shared vision and our commitment to excellence. I found myself drawing on knowledge I had gained from years of working in the industry, but applying it in ways that felt creative and purposeful rather than repetitive and frustrating. The staff hiring process was particularly meaningful because it allowed me to create the kind of work environment I had always wanted to experience. We looked for team members who shared our commitment to professionalism and excellence, and we designed training programs that would help them develop their own skills while contributing to our success. The collaborative atmosphere we created was the opposite of the hierarchical and emotionally charged environment I had known at Rosa's. As our opening date approached, I realized that I was about to achieve something I had never quite allowed myself to imagine. I was going to be a restaurant owner. The title carried weight and responsibility that felt both exciting and sobering. All the knowledge I had gained, all the skills I had developed, and all the relationships I had built were converging into this opportunity to create something entirely my own. The local restaurant community took notice of our venture, with several industry publications writing preview articles about our concept and our backgrounds. The attention was gratifying but also intimidating, as it created expectations for our performance that would be publicly measured. Unlike my previous work at family-owned Rosa's or corporate Ocean View, our success or failure would be entirely attributable to our own decisions and efforts. James and I spent countless hours refining our menu, training our staff, and perfecting our operational systems before we felt ready to open to the public. The preparation was meticulous because we understood that first impressions in the restaurant industry can make or break a new establishment. We wanted every aspect of our operation to reflect the professionalism and attention to detail that would differentiate us from our competitors. The soft opening for friends, family, and industry professionals was nerve-wracking but successful. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive, with guests praising both the food quality and the service excellence. More importantly, the evening revealed that our systems were working as designed and that our staff was capable of executing our vision consistently. The validation was enormous, but I also knew that the real test would come when we opened to the general public. Our official opening was scheduled for a Tuesday in early spring, deliberately chosen as a low-key day that would allow us to work out any remaining issues before facing weekend crowds. The local food critics had made reservations for later in the week, and several influential bloggers had expressed interest in reviewing our restaurant. The pressure was intense, but I felt more prepared and confident than I had ever felt about any professional challenge. The morning of our opening, I arrived at the restaurant before dawn to oversee final preparations and ensure that everything was perfect. Standing in our dining room, surrounded by the beautiful space we had created and the professional team we had assembled, I felt a sense of accomplishment that was unlike anything I had experienced before. This was what I had been working toward my entire career, even when I hadn't fully understood what was possible. The early customers were curious locals who had heard about our restaurant through social media and word-of-mouth promotion. Their enthusiasm and positive feedback gave me confidence that we had created something special that would resonate with our target market. The evening service went smoothly, with only minor issues that were quickly resolved by our well-trained staff. Over the following weeks, our restaurant developed a reputation for excellence that exceeded even our optimistic projections. Reservations became difficult to secure, positive reviews appeared in local publications, and industry professionals began stopping by to see what we had created. The success was validating but also demanding, as we had to maintain consistently high standards while managing rapid growth. The most satisfying aspect of our success was the recognition we received from other restaurant professionals who understood the challenges of building a new establishment from scratch. Their respect was based purely on our achievements and our contributions to the local dining scene, without any consideration of family connections or inherited advantages. For the first time in my career, I was valued entirely for my own accomplishments. 3 months after opening, we received our first major review from the state's most influential restaurant critic. The review was overwhelmingly positive, praising both James's culinary skills and my operational management. Reading professional recognition of my business acumen and leadership abilities was emotional in ways I hadn't anticipated. The little girl who had dreamed of running a successful restaurant had finally achieved that goal, but in ways she never could have imagined. The financial success of our restaurant was equally gratifying. Within 6 months, we were consistently profitable and able to repay our initial investors ahead of schedule. The business model we had developed was proving sustainable, and we were already discussing possibilities for expansion or additional concepts. The dream of restaurant ownership had become a profitable reality that provided both personal satisfaction and financial security. The contrast with my family's struggles at Rosa's was impossible to ignore. While we were thriving with our modern approach and professional management, their traditional restaurant continued to decline despite their resistance to change. The local business community began to recognize me as a successful entrepreneur, rather than as someone's daughter who had worked at a family restaurant. The transformation of my professional identity was complete. My personal relationships also flourished as I became more confident and self-assured. James and I developed a partnership that was both romantic and professional, built on mutual respect and shared ambitions rather than traditional gender roles or family expectations. Our relationship felt like a true collaboration between equals, something I had never experienced before. The success of our restaurant opened doors to opportunities one hadn't even known existed. I was invited to speak at hospitality conferences about restaurant management and entrepreneurship. I was asked to consult with other restaurant owners who were struggling with operational challenges. I was featured in business publications as an example of successful young entrepreneurs in the food service industry. Most importantly, I had created a life that was entirely my own, based on my own choices and efforts rather than family obligations or external expectations. The freedom to pursue my own goals without worrying about disappointing others or failing to meet inherited responsibilities was intoxicating. I had finally become the person I was meant to be, unencumbered by roles that had been assigned to me rather than chosen by me. The journey from dutiful family employee to successful restaurant owner had been longer and more difficult than I had ever imagined, but it had also been more rewarding than I had dared to hope. Every challenge I had overcome, every skill I had developed, and every relationship I had built had contributed to this moment of professional and personal fulfillment. But the most important test of my transformation was still to come, and it would arrive in a way that I never could have predicted. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.